Oh, we have to stay here.
We've got a couple of questions for you guys.
You're not feeling too
That's right. I'm surrounded. That's good. All right. So Andy's going to be bringing us the message this morning, but we thought it'd be good. We've been hearing a bit from Kathy what's going on, but what has actually brought you guys to Tassie this morning?
Yeah, so we're in Tassie because we love Dan and he invited us down. Andy and myself work for Global Interaction. I've just finished up my role to prepare for Cambodia, but we work in the State Office of Global Interaction, which covers Vic and Tas, or Tas and Vic we like to say, yeah. Global Interaction is the Australian Baptist Mission Agency, and so we're here to promote the work of Global Interaction and to engage people in mission, but we're also at the same time here to share our story a bit and share how we kind of recruited ourselves into God's work with Global Interaction and our plans to get off hopefully by the end of the year.
Yeah, cool. So what will you guys be doing over in Cambodia? Maybe Andy, you want to answer this one?
I always feel like I've got lots of talking to do. By the way, I'm not quite sure if I really need to preach today because Ruby and Kathy always do such a good job. The question is, what are we going to be doing when we get there?
Yeah.
Yep. Well, that is always the million-dollar question, and we honestly don't exactly know. Now, that's, why would you pick your family up and move all the way to Cambodia if you don't really know what you're doing? But in essence, what we're going to be doing is just living and working amongst the Khmer people, the Cambodian people, with the real intent just to build relationships with them and ultimately share a story of hope in Jesus Christ. Practically, we get to go there on tourist visas to start with, and we'll be learning language first up so we can actually communicate effectively. And then after that, we'll probably do regular kind of jobs. Kathy's a teacher. Before I was a pastor, I was a banker, so we might do some work around that. But we do what all you guys do in life, really. Pick up a job, live in the neighbourhood and share our lives with people, and hopefully a bit of Jesus along the way, or a lot of Jesus.
Yeah, that's good. Now, so we've got Ruby, Hugo and Charlie. What are you guys excited about heading over to Cambodia?
Meeting new friends and riding on the motor scooters.
Yeah, they looked pretty good.
Going on the tuk-tuk.
Going to the international school and meeting friends from all around the world.
Yeah, wow. That's cool. Now, I think, Hugo, and maybe Ruby, you had one that you weren't looking forward to, or something that's happened that you weren't looking forward to.
Injections.
All the injections, getting prepared to get over. But it's good. They're good for you, I'm sure. That's good. All right. Well, how about we pray for you guys before Andy brings the message.
Cool.
Let's pray. Lord, we just want to thank you for this family and their willingness to serve you over in Cambodia. And as a church, Lord, we just want to pray over them for safety, for guidance, for a clear vision once they get there too of how they can be your hands and feet in the community to see your name proclaimed, especially in such an area that just has no idea of who you are. So I just pray that as this family here goes and represents you, may there be a shining light, a great example for you in your name. Amen. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. I'm just going to go grab my Bible, if that's all right.
Doing that, I mentioned that Andy's got a stall out the front here at Mornington if you want to check out more and chatting to them about how you can support them and be praying for them in their time ahead.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and a big shout out to all those people out at Lena Valley as well. It is really good to be here and share with you. We do consider it a great privilege. Global Interaction is an organisation that's been around for over 140 years, and it's had a few different incarnations along the way, but more recently it was known as the ABMS, Australian Baptist Missionary Society, and about 20 years ago we changed our name to Global Interaction. And at the moment our focus, and it has been for some time, is to work amongst the least reached people groups of the world. So at the moment we've got 9 groups that we work with. We're in Africa, in Malawi and Mozambique. We're in Central Asia. We're in the Silk Road region and also in Southeast Asia. And really, we express our mission in many different ways, but the best way that we feel that we can do that at the moment is to really help local communities find their own distinctive ways of following Jesus and to walk alongside them. So my parents, I've got a little bit of heritage in this. I'm not really a missionary kid, but my parents were missionaries in India in the 1960s, and they'd come home before I was born. But they worked amongst the Indian people in northeast India, that little pocket above Bangladesh. And it's a really great story, and it gives us a lot of encouragement because what we do is a very long work. We don't go in and out in a couple of years. We really like to have a long-term presence, which is why we take our time to learn the local language, because if we feel that we try to express Jesus' love to people through an interpreter, 3/4 of the message will just get lost in translation. So my parents went out to India in 1962, and the Australian Baptists had been there for just on 15 years when they went there. And prior to that, they went just after the end of the Second World War. And prior to that, there'd been no Christians in that area at all. And when they left at the end of 1969, there was about 300 local believers in the area. And you think 20 years, 5 families had come through. That's a pretty good effort. And my parents came home for a home assignment. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a Melbourne flu at the moment, so I apologise if I'm a little bit croaky. So they'd been there for 20 years, the Australian Baptists, and 300 believers had come to faith. And they went home for their home assignment. They went back on the boat with full intention to come back and to continue the work. But during that 12 months that they were home, the Indian government decided to kick out all missionaries, and they never got to go back. Fast forward literally 45 years. My dad died in 2013, and it was one of his last wishes that we would scatter his ashes in India, because it was a place that he never really left emotionally. So in 2015, a couple of years later, Kathy and myself and Charlie, our oldest, went across, and we took my mum, who was a little old lady by that stage, and my oldest brother, who was 6 years old when he came home. And I was fortunate enough to speak at the 75th anniversary of the Australian Baptist being in the area. And I spoke in front of 20,000 people, which is, a strange experience in itself. There's more Christian believers than there are Baptists in all of Victoria now, and New South Wales and Tasmania and South Australia combined. And to see my mum go back there and, you talk and you say, Mum, what do you think about this? You must have done amazing work. And she said, no, not really. We were just there and we made a few relationships. And in effect, that's what it's really all about. As a family, we don't really envisage ourselves changing Cambodia. We're going to go over there, and there's a number of other families there in Siem Reap at the moment. Global Interaction's been in that area for about 5 years. And we want to do our little bit. But really, in effect, what we're doing is we're just hoping to open the hearts of a few people in that area where God can come in and make a difference, and then let God do the work and let the message flow from there. So maybe in 50 years' time, when I've died and my children are taking me back to scatter my ashes there, hopefully, there'll be a gathering of tens of thousands of people who know and follow Jesus. And that's what really excites me about our little adventure. So up until this time, Kathy's been a school teacher, I've been a pastor, I've just resigned in the last 12 months from a church in inner city Melbourne, and we were loving that work. And people say to us, why are you going? Why would you do this? Why would you pick your family up? And, poor little Hugo, he's had about, 12 different injections or something so far. Japanese encephalitis and rabies and typhoid and all kinds of other stuff. Siem Reap's, I don't know if you know much about it, but it's a small regional town, but it's on the doorstep of the Angkor Wat temples, which are quite famous for Cambodia. But why would you pick your kids up and your family up and go and do this thing. Leaving, in all relative terms, a pretty comfortable life in Melbourne. Ultimately, the reason is that we feel that we've got a message to share, a message of hope and a message of a transforming God who can make a real difference. And that's ultimately what drives us. Most of you would be aware of a little bit of Cambodia's recent history. They've got a rich, long history going back thousands of years, which is centred around those Angkor Wat temples. But in the last 30 to 40 years, they've had a terrible history where really the world told them that they didn't matter. Kathy alluded to in the little children's talk that 75% of the people in Cambodia, it's a population of about 14 million people, are under the age of 30. Kathy and I travelled there just on 12 months ago as we were making our final, discernment and deciding, if this call was real or not. And the one thing you do notice when you travel around Cambodia is you never see any old people. And that is a direct result of the genocide that took place in the late 1970s. The other thing that you notice a lot is that there are a lot of people with missing limbs. There were more landmines laid in Cambodia than there were in the whole of World War II. And that nation is still feeling the effects of that, literally. What happens is that the UN has been in there since the early 1990s when the country reopened up. And they've been clearing the landmines ever since. But every time a monsoon comes, they all float back to the surface. So not so much around Siem Reap because they've done a really good job around that area. But in the more rural areas, the number one rule for our kids is don't wander off into the rice fields because people lose limbs all the time. My first experience or understanding or awareness of Cambodia came in 1979. This is showing my age a little bit, when I was in prep. And we grew up in eastern suburban Melbourne, which was completely Anglo. There were no other kids in our primary school who weren't white. And a young family came along halfway through my first year in primary school, and they were a Cambodian family. And there was a boy in my class called Serena, and he had an older brother, and he had a mum who was a fair bit younger than my mum, but that was all good. And I ended up actually going through all of primary school and all of high school with Serena. And in about year 8 or year 9, when you become a little bit more aware of the world around you, I started asking a few questions about his life and how he'd come to Australia. It only took me about 7 years to do that. And it turned out that he was actually one of 7 children. And the person that I thought was his mum was actually his older sister. And he had no idea where his parents were or 4 of his other siblings. Ruby's got a classmate at the moment called Fifi, and her dad is Khmer, Cambodian, and her mum is a Kiwi. And speaking to Philippe, he has got a very similar story. He has no idea where his parents ended up or 2 of his siblings. And these stories are repeated again and again and again. We talk about 6 degrees of separation. In Cambodia, it's about 1 degree or half a degree of separation. Everybody has got a story of either an immediate family member or a relative who disappeared during that time. And people ask me, about Cambodia, and people have commented to me that when they've travelled in Vietnam and then they come across to Cambodia, that it seems to be a darker kind of place. And on the surface, that's probably the case. But strangely, I find a real hope around it as well. And maybe that's because there are so many young people, and young people have a disposition to have more hope than perhaps some of those who are a bit older. But I believe that hope is just a little seed of God already being there. Now, less than 2% of the population in Cambodia follow Jesus, and less than 5% of the population would actually know somebody who knows or follows Jesus. But we genuinely believe, and there's good reason for it in the Bible, that God is already in that place and at work. And we're going to simply dwell amongst the people and hopefully show them a little bit of a glimpse of this person that we call Jesus and follow. With the hope that they will come to see that Jesus is a God who transforms lives and who heals beyond expectation. Because as I said, the Cambodian people for a long, long time now have been told not only by the Pol Pot regime, but also the world in general, who turned a blind eye to this for too many years. They've been told that they don't matter. Whereas the reality is that they matter a great deal. Not only to their fellow human beings, but to the creator of this universe. And I think that's a pretty special message to tell. We read from Acts chapter 14 today, which I'd like to share a little bit from now. And I like this passage because it tells the story of the great missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas. And it's got a bit of no-holds-barred kind of message about it. You know, it talks about how Paul was moving around and he was having some really good successes and some not good successes. And, if you read the chapters around it, at some points he was fearful of his life and he had to flee, which isn't a prospect that we really, would expect to happen in Cambodia, but, it's one of those things. And there's this particular story around chapter 14 where Paul finds himself speaking in front of a large group of people. Now, we're not really quite sure how many people are there, but it would be safe to assume that there would be hundreds, if not a couple of thousand people listening to him. And as I said, he's been moving around this area for some time, so he's getting a little bit of attention and people are interested in what he's got to say, not necessarily because they want to follow Jesus, but because, he's a person of interest and it's causing a lot of debate. And they come along and he's speaking one morning in front of this crowd, preaching it up a little bit. And there's a lot of important people there. And a few hangers-on and a few others. And halfway through, Paul spots a person in the front row. Sorry, that is Dan, isn't it? Yep. I've got the bright lights on me. I can pick on you then. And something interesting happens. Now, this man is a person who, we're told, has been lame from birth. And he's most likely been brought there that morning by his handlers, his minders, on a mat and just placed down the front where lots of people will pass by. And the idea is that hopefully they'll throw him a few coins or whatever. Now, this person won't actually get to keep all that money because he's got his minders who are exploiting him because of his disability. And generally speaking, people won't really take much notice of him. And I don't know about you in this little part of the world, but certainly where we live, we see people like this every single day. We're lucky enough to live almost right in the heart of Melbourne. For you who know Melbourne a little bit, we live about 200 metres, give or take, maybe 300 metres from the Queen Victoria Market. We can jump on the tram and be in the city within about 10 minutes. That's kind of our proximity to the Melbourne CBD. And we live in a little apartment block with some great people, and straight across the road there's this vibrant kind of Errol Street space, which is, cafes, restaurants, a real hub. We rarely actually go to the supermarket and do a proper shop every week because you always just walk across to the IGA to grab whatever you want. And on the way, invariably when you're walking past the ATMs, you'll see what we would call a punter, a homeless person, a person, with a little note saying, give me $1 for some food today. And I fall into this trap at times, maybe a lot, where you just walk past them. Sometimes you'll engage, sometimes you'll talk to them, sometimes you'll give them money. But if you look at them a little bit over time, people generally won't give them the time of day. And inherently, if we're really honest about what's going on, we're making a judgment call. We're saying, you must have done something, or it must be a result of what your parents have done that you've ended up in this situation. That's the reality of it. Maybe you made bad choices early on and you became, drug addicted or dependent. Or maybe you've just been in generational welfare dependence and you've never really learnt how to go out and earn a real living. And you can make that judgment in about 3 seconds as just you walk past. I don't know whether you guys heard in the last month or so, there was a young woman who was murdered not very far from where we live in Royal Park. And in the first 12 to 24 hours, it came out that this person had mental health issues. She was discovered in bushland, not really very far from where we are at all, around the Melbourne Zoo kind of area. And it came out really early that, she'd been, she had mental health problems and she'd had a drug dependency for some time. And then it emerged in the next 48 hours or so that in fact she'd come from a really good family and that she was educated, and that some things had happened in her life which had affected her in a way where she turned to this way of life. And you could feel the tone in the newspapers and in the general community and the talk around our area changed a little bit. And people became far more sympathetic of this person's plight and what, had brought her to this state where she was a homeless person who'd been brutally murdered. I can't remember what day of the week that she died, but within a week they then held a vigil, which was on a Friday night, and it was freezing, it was raining and it was drizzling, and over 1,000 people came and turned up to pay honour to her. When we walk past these people who sit outside the ATMs and whatever, we make a judgment call with no idea about how they got there. And we devalue their story. But I can guarantee you, if I grabbed one of those guys and I took him home and I gave him a shower and I fed him for a week and put him in a nice suit and gave him a briefcase and got him to walk straight past all those people 2 weeks later, people would look at him completely differently. Society would look at him completely differently. And that's exactly what was going on with this man in front of Paul on that day who was on a mat. The people of that time had a theological construct, which is just a really, really fancy way of saying that the way that they viewed the world was influenced by what they thought of God or the gods. The common view in that day was that if you were a lame person or a lame person from birth, well then you had done something to upset the gods. Or your parents or your forefathers had done something to upset the gods, and this was your punishment. And as a result of that, you weren't part of society. You didn't deserve the respect of society. In much the same way as we make a judgment call on those people that you must have done something or made poor choices to end up like you have, in the same way, society back in Paul's time viewed these people that you must have done something to upset the gods or God to end up in the state that you were in. They didn't matter and they didn't belong to society. And Paul's preaching away and he spots this person and there's an immediate little interaction. They lock eyes and he's probably feeling a little bit nervous, but he's a little bit intrigued. He's, oh, crap, he really is looking at me. And we're told that Paul looks intently in his eyes and he says, stand up. And at that, the man immediately stood up. Now, I find that remarkable in many, many ways. I mean, first of all, I think that we become desensitised to these stories as we read them in the Bible. Oh yeah, just another healing. But can you imagine never have to have never walked in your life, and some dude who's preaching away says, stand up, and you just pop up? Like, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I think it's remarkable. I got a little bit of a sore back just in general. And when I get up in the morning, I'm a bit stiff and sore. I honestly struggle to touch my toes. I've been awake for about 2 hours now. I can't touch my toes. Like, when I try to put my shoes on in the morning, sometimes it's a bit of a struggle for me. This guy might be 20, 25, 30 years old and he's never walked, and he just leaps up. That is a miracle. It really is. Got someone with a bit of grey hair down here laughing. You know exactly what I'm talking about. But that's not actually the real miracle of this story. Because as you read on further and further, a little bit more of the story unfolds. All of a sudden, this man, who everyone had looked down upon, got a little bit of recognition from society again, and he was brought back into society, where he was a valued member again. In much the same way that if you put someone in a suit, something changes, people actually look at them a little bit differently. Maybe that's a little bit superficial. All of a sudden, this woman who'd been murdered in the park just near our place, when they understood her story, all of a sudden she mattered again, and 1,000 people turn up who'd never known her to honour her. But even then, that's not actually the real miracle of the story. The real miracle of this story is that all of a sudden, this man understood that he mattered to God, that he actually was worth something, that his life was worth something, and that the creator of this universe actually had a plan and purpose for him. And I think that's the most amazing, transformative part of this story. It says that Paul looked at him and saw that he had the faith to be healed. Now, I honestly don't think that faith was centred around, oh, gee, this man speaking up the front is going to allow me to walk again. I don't think that was the faith that he had. I think the faith to be healed probably centred around, maybe I'll get noticed today. Maybe someone will smile at me today. Maybe I might not get all of my money stolen by my handlers. Maybe I'll actually get a square meal for the day. I think that was probably his expectation of healing. This God who created the universe heals beyond expectation. And I think that's going to be the real message that we will hopefully take to Cambodia. That this country, which has been told for so long, not only by its own people, but by the rest of the world, that it doesn't matter, will actually start to finally understand that the Cambodian people matter to God. When Kathy was pregnant with Charlie, our firstborn, at about the 10-week mark, she had an ultrasound. And the reason for that was that she just had a little bit of spotting, and we'd never been parents before, and we weren't really quite sure. So we went to the doctor, and the doctor said, yeah, it'll be fine, but, it's probably best just to go have a quick ultrasound just to make sure that everything's in order. So we go along, and I can never remember, what's the name of the person who does the gel thing? Stenographer or something? Yeah? Technician? Smears Kathy's stomach with a gel, going away. It's pretty quiet for a couple of minutes, and finally she says, yeah, everything looks absolutely fine. And then we all relax, and then she starts having a bit of fun and starts pointing out things, and, that's the spinal cord, and that's the arms, and, that's the little stumps of the legs, and we're going away. And then I see this little flicker, and I say to the technician, what's that? And she goes, oh, that's the heartbeat. Oh, that's really, really cool. Flicking away. You've seen your child, Charlie's almost, how old is she now? Almost 12 years old, and I still find it amazing. And then I say to her, oh, by the way, how big's the baby at the moment? And she goes, oh, probably a little bit smaller than a grain of rice. Isn't that amazing? I find that amazing. I really do. That God could create something so beautiful and minute in detail and such, that's a heartbeat. And the things like, I mean, she's still pretty small now, but like the size of a grain of rice. We're the first generation really to have even come close to understanding how magnificent God's creation is. For a long time, for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, we've been able to look up into the stars and get some kind of appreciation of how vast the universe is. And, even in my lifetime, the Hubble telescope's up there now and, it can look further and longer. In 1977, I think it was, NASA launched a probe. It's still going now. It's out of our galaxy. I've got two friends exactly almost the same age as me, twins, Stevie and Paulie. When Leah, their mum, had Paul, back in 1972, she thought it was all done. And then the doctor said, oh, by the way, you've got another one coming. All right, giddy up, let's go again. Even in my lifetime, we've never been able to look the other way. We've always been able to understand how vast and great the universe is. But we're the first generation who's got close to even understanding how minute and intricate God's creation is as well. And I'm sure that when my kids are my age, we'll be blown away by the detail of God's creation, even more so than what we are today. This God who created this vast universe, and then this browny, greeny blob of a thing called Earth and put all these people on it, is intently interested in who we are as people. Who you are, who you are, who you are, and who the Cambodian people are. And I just can't go beyond that. I really can't. So our challenge is, as a people, I think, to simply share that message. And we don't have to be eloquent or amazingly trained at theological college or go to Arrow or anything. I honestly believe that all we need to do is just open up our hearts to people, which will open their hearts, and that will give God an opportunity to move in and do his work. We've got a couple of pictures, I think, ready to go. Yes. So this is not on the screen. Is it on the screen? Have you guys got that? Yes, there we go. Beautiful. We've got a little place down at Port Fairy, which is in the southwest corner of Victoria. Do you guys know where that is? Like Warrnambool, Portland kind of way? Beautiful. And on the way, there's these rock walls, dry walls, which go for hundreds of kilometres. So they're in a fairly small area. And the story of them is that it's a highly volcanic kind of area. Great farmland. You see all these luscious, beautiful cows eating that munchy grass. Southwest milk is awesome. But there's rocks everywhere. So a lot of these farms have been in the same families for generations, 5 or 6 generations. And the story is that when they first arrived, that the land wasn't actually very useful because it was just covered in volcanic rock. So the farmers and their families over time collected these rocks, and instead of just making a big pile, they made use of them. And they made these dry walls. Now, I always talk about this with the kids, and they get a little bit, sick of it when we're going past, but I am fascinated by it. So they're about 1 metre high, about that wide, and, they form all these beautiful fences. And now they're heritage listed, these dry walls. And some of them were built by the convicts, but most of them were built by families. And the thing about them is that when you look at them from a distance and even up in close, they are an amazing work. But not one farmer or family or generation can actually lay claim to that work. many people, many generations, many hands have contributed to the work, but no one can lay claim to it. But it is magnificent. We've got another slide as well. The other thing about it is that if you look up a little bit closer, they're actually made up of not perfectly shaped and formed rocks. They're all different sizes. As I said, they're not uniform in shape. Some of them are actually a bit broken. Some of them fall down off the wall and need to be picked up from time to time. And they're a little bit rough around the edges. But they make up this amazing wall. And I think about this mission work in exactly the same way. I mean, clearly when my mum went back to India in 2015 and saw tens of thousands of people, you know, she could never lay claim to that work. She was one tiny little part of it. But the thing is that even the people on the field can't lay claim to the work because there were thousands of Christians back home and hundreds of churches who were supporting them. So in much the same way, we want to invite you to join us in this work in Cambodia. Now, we all can't go, clearly. It'd be good if we could all go. But the reality is that that's not the case. But we're inviting you to join the work. And the best way you can do that is to pray for us, to be interested in our story and to continue to tell our story when we're gone. And you can also contribute financially. But that's not the main thing. I mean, the economic reality is that it costs money to live there and, you know, school the kids and pay for the injections and, you know, for housing and everything. So that's important. And we can't go unless, you know, we have some money in place. But what keeps us there and what keeps the work going there is people praying for us and the Khmer people. And that's simply all we're really asking for or inviting you to be part of today. And when you go down to the local shopping centre or wherever it is, or your school or your work or wherever you come into contact with people, just simply do the same things that we're doing. Live your life, interact with people, smile upon them, and hopefully the opening of their hearts will allow God to come in and transform their lives and provide a healing beyond expectation. Amen.